Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. We put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. And please find out more about us at virginiainstitute.org. All of our white papers, legislative stuff, even through this troubling time at the General Assembly, special session, regular session. We'll be looking towards 2021 as well. Quite a bit there, but lots going on. Tuesday morning group coalition meetings starting to meet in person again. And our next guest is the president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. You'd wonder, how could something so obvious as right to work need a legal defense? But see Second Amendment, too, on top of that. He is Mark Mix. Mark, welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing this afternoon?
Well, I'm doing fine, Joe. Thanks for the opportunity to talk. And yes, there is a fire hose worth of issues out there to talk about, so I'm glad to get a chance to talk about one that we've been involved in recently.
Yeah, I've told people it's like drinking from a fire hose, but at least I'm hydrated, you know. So
Indeed.
So Mark, the First Circuit ruled about 2 weeks ago that the Labor Relations Board ruling in a decade-long case, First Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the National Labor Relations Board, that union bosses couldn't thug up on even public sector unions. There was a nurse, wasn't it, in Rhode Island, Jeanette Geary?
Yeah, that's right, Joe. This was an interesting case, and once again it shows how one individual with some courage can stand up and fight and can win a major case, albeit in the First Circuit. But the precedent that was established there is very important. And, Joe, this is it's kind of a good news, bad news story in the sense that what Jeanette Geary was fighting for, who was a nurse who was working in Warwick, Rhode Island, she was fighting to basically defend her rights that were established by a Supreme Court case back in 1988 that we at the National Right to Work Foundation litigated, called Beck versus Communication Workers of America. In that case, the court said very clearly that union officials could not charge workers for lobbying activity outside of their bargaining unit. And you know, it's interesting because what happened in this case was the union that she was forced to be associated with, even though she wasn't a member of the union, she was forced to associate with the union because the union imposed its exclusive monopoly voice over her. They were lobbying in other states. They were lobbying on issues in other state legislatures, and she said, wait a minute, I can't be forced to pay for that. And the union said, well, I'll tell you what, you either pay for it or we get you fired. And they would not give her basic information that is also required by another Supreme Court victory we won called Hudson, where union officials in states where workers can't protect themselves with right-to-work laws can ask for an accounting and an independent audit of what the union's spending their money on. But this union wouldn't comply with that either. So the odyssey begins in 2009, and as you said, Joe, it ends just about 3 weeks ago in the First Circuit Court of Appeals.
You know, every time we speak, Mark, it gobsmacks me how the unions have come full circle from a group of organizations 100 years ago that were coming together to try to protect workers' rights, doing just the opposite. And they've become the thugs that they claimed the mine owners and the mill owners were 100 years ago.
Yeah, Joe. I mean, it's really frustrating and somewhat fascinating to see that evolution. You know, you now have stories across the country with the United Auto Workers and the corruption there, and the Teamsters Union with corruption there, and the American Federation of Government Employees with corruption there. Mm-hmm. And the bottom line is this compulsion, this forced unionism power that they were granted back in 1935 and granted in various states through public sector unionization, basically leads to compulsion, and it leads to corruption. This compulsion leads to corruption. It was Senator McClellan in the hearings in 1959, the Landrum Griffin hearings, that said, you know, this compulsion and corruption go hand in hand because union officials, it's hard to hold them accountable. And in a case like Geary's up in the First Circuit, it literally took, you know, from 2009 to this year, 11 years to get this thing done. We had a Supreme Court case where the President of the United States, then President Barack Obama, violated the Constitution with recess appointees at the National Labor Relations Board that ruled against Jeanette Geary, and then it had to be appealed to the D.C. Circuit, where we got a ruling there, and then the union appeals that case, and we end up in the First Circuit. And now, interestingly enough, after we won the case in the First Circuit with a unanimous 3-judge panel, they have now asked for an en banc hearing to have the case reviewed. So now 7 new justices, well, seven active justices in the First Circuit will at some point hear this and see if they want to overturn what's happened for Jeanette Geary. So the fight goes on, Joe.
Well, and it's a template, Mark. You know, it's almost like you feel like, okay, here comes the en banc hearing. I mean, I until I met this Cuccinelli fellow, I had never even heard the phrase en banc. You know, you start hearing about, you know, well, okay, so we've got all the judges, but we didn't like their ruling, so we're going to call all the other judges in, and it becomes almost silly a little bit after a while. I understand that our courts are supposed to be there to defend your rights, but this seems like almost an incredible waste of time for the courts to continue to be trying to fight one individual nurse of all people in 2020.
Yeah, indeed. But then again, you know, as you look at the litigation, Joe, as you look at this process, basically by continuing the legal fight, they can continue to exercise their privileges over these workers. And, you know, we've got a case up in Delaware right now. We're representing employees who are trying to get rid of a union in a poultry operation up there. And we filed a case on their behalf. The NLRB ruled in our favor. The union appealed it to the full NLRB. And all during this time, they are still able to collect dues and fees from workers as a condition of their employment. So there's a revenue side of this too. The longer the litigation goes on, the longer that these workers can be compelled to pay them fees, and it's really just an outrage. I mean, in Virginia, one of the 27 right-to-work states, workers can choose to join unions if they want to, and they can support a union financially if they want to, and they can have the union speak for them if they want to. But unfortunately, in the 23 states across the country, you can lose your job if you do not accept the union as, one, your voice in the workplace, two, your forced association with them, and three, if you don't pay them a fee for the privilege of giving up your rights.
And then they'll use your money to fight you if you wind up in court with them, because that's how they're paying their lawyers.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting with the UAW scandal. I don't know if you followed that, Joe. It's been a big story. It hasn't been written about as much as it should be, probably, but I think it's now 12 executives from the United Auto Workers Union, International Union up in Detroit, are either guilty or in jail for embezzlement and racketeering. Those are not my words. Those are the U.S. Attorney's words up there. And interestingly enough, both of the former presidents, the most recent former president and then the former president before him, have pled guilty. And guess what? They used the union's legal fund for their legal defense.
Of course.
And
that they were
I guess they're
embezzling
going to have
from.
to pay it back, but it's just crazy.
Mark Mixon with us from the National Right to Work Foundation. This is what happens is you get these organizations with large piles of money and then the power that goes along with them to direct, you know, funds to this organization or that organization. My father-in-law was a union treasurer for 20-odd years on Long Island at a machine shop that he started because he found that the corruption that was going on there with immigrants who couldn't speak the language and they were being ripped off by the shop steward, and he started one. And he said, you know, he would constantly rail about the corrupt behavior that some of the other unions in the area were getting away with, you know, pushing around businesses. And he said, listen, if the business leaves, it doesn't matter what our union contract says. The business is now gone, and we have no jobs.
Yeah, and unfortunately, just last week, I think it's the building trades union boss up there in New York was just indicted on these type of racketeering and extortion charges and no-show jobs and asking contractors to install an ice cube maker in his house. He said he'd been waiting for it for 2 years, and then giving protection to non-union employers to hire non-union employees if they just would kick a little money back to him and his friends. I mean, these are the types of stories that come out of an institution that is designed and relies on compulsion. I mean, it's a great business model, Joe. I mean, you wouldn't have to do the hard work work that you do to keep a radio show going if
sure.
everyone had to listen to you and was required to listen to you, right? You do it just because you're a professional, but you wouldn't have to if everyone was forced to listen to you.
Well, I'll tell you something. You want your comeuppance, go to a union broadcast operation, and I'm used to kind of pushing the buttons and moving. You can't even turn the light switch on. Without, the union guy has got to come over there. I went to Las Vegas for a broadcast for the first time ever. I went out to Mark Skouson's Freedom Fest. And I set up in the ballroom. They had never had. Now, of course, Mark's Mr. Media. Now he's got John Stossel comes out there and everything else. But I was the first guy to ever do a broadcast from Freedom Fest. And I get out there, and I'm in a ballroom next to the bookstore. And I get in there, it's 3 o'clock in the morning because I go on the air at 5, and the music is playing so loud because I guess the security guards were listening to music over the PA. So I just go, I find the volume control for it, and I turn it down. I got 3 union thugs in front of me saying, "You don't touch that." And I realized you couldn't even carry your books from your van to the lobby. You had to get union employees to do it. It is probably one of the most union corrupt towns out there in Las Vegas, and everyone thinks it's this libertarian paradise. It's worse than Chicago out there.
Yeah, those are interesting stories about trade shows, and I remember talking to one vendor who was going to trade shows and setting up one display in Chicago, I think at the Daily Center, and the overall cost for setting up his display was $40,000 to set up the display. It was a big display, obviously. They had lots of things going on. They went to a trade show in Orlando, which is a right-to-work state. They went down there, and guess how? It cost 10 times less to set up the same exact display at a convention center down there. And, those are the types of built-in costs, the feather bedding that exists in these situations. And again, it comes with that monopoly power. And, you have these cases like Jeanette Geary in Rhode Island where she's simply fighting for the notion, yes, okay, I get it. If I'm going to continue to work here, I have to pay a fee to the union, but you're not going to use my money for ideological causes or political causes or lobbying causes, which I disagree with. And that's a pretty straightforward First Amendment protection. In fact, we see it now with the Janus decision that we won back in June of 2018 on behalf of all government employees across the country. The Supreme Court said that everything that a government union does is political by nature because they're redressing government. And so all their speech is political, and therefore the First Amendment protects government employees from this type of intrusion on their rights. Unfortunately, we still have work to do in the private sector for these workers that in the 23 states that don't have right-to-work laws can continue to be forced to pay fees or lose their jobs. It's outrageous.
Well, and Mark, we're running into a dangerous place because Lee Carter, the Democratic Socialist member of the Virginia House of Delegates, tried during the regular session pre-COVID to overturn Virginia's right to work and was rebuffed. But now as we hear more and more of the rhetoric regarding the hourly wage workers and some of the folks in the skilled trades that are, quote, on the front lines of COVID-19 and have to, quote unquote, go back to work because their jobs don't have the kind of benefits that would allow them to take 2 or 3 weeks off and stay safe and that kind of thing. I'm worried that we're going to use COVID-19 as the fulcrum, if not during what remains of this special session, but certainly when we come back in January of next year to try to overturn it again.
Yeah, I don't doubt that Lee Carter will try it. That's a typical socialist program. He believes that he is smarter than everyone else. He knows what's right for everyone, and so therefore they're going to impose this compulsion on Virginia's workers. They're going to take away their choice to decide whether or not to support a private organization. That's classic socialism. It's probably, I could use stronger words, but it's just, it's that type of elitism that Lee Carter demonstrates, that somehow he believes he's smarter than Virginia's rank-and-file workers who can choose for themselves and have chosen for themselves whether or not they want to associate with the labor union. I mean, it's really amazing when you think about when you just take the first layer of dirt off their argument and say, you know what, we think it's right to force everyone to join a private organization or pay dues to a private organization in order to work. I mean, what an outrageous position.
But what they did do during the General Assembly is come up with a law that allows for public sector employees, I guess police, fire, and municipal hospital employees like nurses to join public sector unions.
Yeah, that's right. It's basically a local option bill. They tried for a full-fledged bargaining bill to, New York style, Illinois
Collective,
style,
yeah.
California style, the style that has broken the banks and the backs of the taxpayers of those states with just unbelievably unpayable pensions and cost obligations for the cost of government. They tried that, and they got this local option bill that Senator Dick Saslaw thought was reasonable for the Commonwealth of Virginia, which is really outrageous. We had a chance to try to go down there and testify, and all of a sudden, the next thing we know, this bill is passed, and Saslaw's got it all done. I walk up to him, and I say, what just happened here? And he said, well, you had your chance. Well, no, we didn't have a chance to talk about it, but the Democrats imposed that. And, it's interesting, Joe, because Virginia, previous to that local option, which basically will find itself working its way through Fairfax and Loudoun and Prince William counties here probably when it goes into effect in May of next year, what's interesting about that was Governor Doug Wilder in 1993 that signed the bill saying, you know what? It's not appropriate for union officials to get in between taxpayers and their elected officials to bargain over terms and conditions of employment. Doug Wilder signed that bill opposing the unionization, or not the unionization, but the recognition of unions for purposes of bargaining. I mean, we don't deny the firefighters joining a voluntary organization to amplify their voice. They do. They're very effective. The teachers union, they have teachers that want to have their voice amplified, but recognizing them, forcing a municipality or forcing the Commonwealth of Virginia to recognize them in order to negotiate terms and conditions of employment, that's an entirely different matter. And that's what Doug Wilder opposed when he was governor in 1993.
Oh, I've talked to Governor Wilder on frequent occasions. He and I have great conversations because often he and I find ourselves both on the outs with our chosen political parties or obvious political affiliations. And he said that, one of the reasons was it wasn't helping the black community. It was actually hurting the black community, and that, the right to associate freely for work was going to help, people in the poor community work their way out of it.
Yeah, and that's the appeal that we're seeing now with President Trump and the growing numbers of minorities that are supporting him. I think that finally, and I don't know if I shouldn't say finally, it appears that there is a crack in that facade where people have said, oh, yeah, you're on our team, and so you have to vote for us. I think Biden said it the best, right? Didn't he say that to some guy named Charlemagne the God or something like that?
Charlemagne the God. We love him. Mark Mix on with us from the National Right to Work Foundation. But now the president, during his builder days in the 70s and 80s, I mean, he saw all those New York, Manhattan labor situations. Had New York not been in the financial straits that it was, he would never have been able to build in Manhattan because he wasn't considered a Manhattan-approved builder by these trades unions.
Yeah, that's an interesting environment in which he had to pour concrete and install pipe and electrical systems. I'm not sure I know exactly plumb the depths of all of that, but I'm sure that was a difficult environment for him.
Well, and I think that gives him a unique feeling for what does help the workforce of a country. He's built in Florida and he's built in New York, and he's seen all these different situations and how to run businesses around them to the benefit of those who work there. And as a business owner, I guess really it comes down to the better you treat your employees, the less you need to worry about labor unions. As a rule, we see this with some of the right-to-work states with automotive manufacturing, where the UAW tries to get in, only to find them rebuffed by the employees saying, we got a fine here.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Joe. I've been doing this work for 35-plus years now, or 35 years now, just about 35 years. And one thing I've learned is that generally if an employer is unionized, it's usually because it was unionized before. It's been unionized for a long time. In fact, we know that only about 8 to 10% of all workers who are in unions actually voted for the union that represents them at this present day. But if you will get a union if you earn it, and that's what an employer who doesn't take care of employees will get. And the law protects workers' rights to join together that way to unionize and amplify their voice. And if your employer is not treating your employees well, you're going to probably get a union, and that's the reality of it. But employers now are much more enlightened in dealing with their employees, and that's why the unionization rate in the country is almost just at 6%. About 6.2% of the private sector workforce are represented by unions and union members. But yet workers are still getting paychecks, and as you mentioned, the automotive industry is flourished in the right to work states. And frankly, when the president stands up because of his experience that you just mentioned, I mean, his job, what he wants to do is create opportunities. He wants to bring manufacturing back to the United States. If you were a union official, Joe, and your business was recruiting workers to pay dues to you, wouldn't you want more job opportunities in the United States? Wouldn't you want to grow the manufacturing base in the United States? Wouldn't you support a president who's trying to cut down regulations so we can invest more money in more jobs and have more workers here that, if you're Richard Trumka, you want to organize those workers. The more workers out there to organize, the better off you'd be. Doesn't that make sense?
And that is the kind of case that the president, unlike a lot of other Republicans who probably just wouldn't even engage at Trumka, just saying, "Oh, I'm a Republican, I can't talk to you," this president would actually sit down with him and say, "Hey, let's talk this through." And I forgot to mention this. Mark Mick's on with us from the National Right to Work Foundation. I mean, you look at Grumman moving its, manufacturing all to its South Carolina facility from the Pacific Northwest. Now, they point to the riots and the unrest and the unlawfulness in the Seattle area, but that's a big blow for union labor because Grumman's already facing backlogs, orders being held up because the airlines are on stasis as it is anyway, and they're like, well, we're going to move all of our manufacturing to South Carolina. Great for South Carolina, right?
Yeah, indeed. I think you're talking about Boeing. Is that correct? Their 787 flight line. They just made that announcement.
Yeah, did I say Grumman? I apologize. I think I said the wrong aircraft company. I apologize.
Yeah, no, but Boeing created the new plant in North Charleston, which they employ now about 7,000 people down there. And if you may not remember this, and I followed it because we ended up representing employees in South Carolina. When Boeing was ready to open that plant down in North Charleston, the NLRB under Obama stepped in and filed unfair labor practice charges against them, issued a complaint, and tried to stop them from opening that plant because they said they were hot cargoing jobs from Washington State to the right to work state of South Carolina, when in fact not one job was lost out in Washington. These were new jobs that were created because of the demand for this innovative aircraft. And so they built this facility, but now they have announced that they're going to bring the entire 787 production facility to South Carolina and to the right to work state of South Carolina for, I think, are important reasons. That's why they cited there in the first place, I think, because they'd been shut down, and they went to the International Association of Machinists when they were thinking about expanding the production line and said, look, we've had 5 strikes in the last 20 years, and it's cost us lots of money. Can you please, because we had I think at the time they had something like 800 backlog orders on the aircraft, and they said, can you please just guarantee the continuity of a production line? And the union bosses said no. So that's why they bought an aircraft company in South Carolina. They retooled it, restarted it, rebuilt it, and I think initially with 1,000, 2,000 jobs, and now they're up to 7,000. It's a beautiful site, Joe. You go there, it's right outside the airport in North Charleston, and at 4 o'clock in the morning where there's a shift change, I've been there getting to the airport to fly out, and you see these beautiful new trucks of Ford F-150s and other trucks driving in there in the morning, and the parking lot's filled, and they're making American aircrafts, and they're selling them internationally, and it's a beautiful thing. It works very nicely.
And it's a great success story. Mark Mix, thank you so much. Again, it's National Right to Work Foundation, NRTW.org. Mark, thank you so much for everything you do and running us through this and all these other cases, fighting what should be just so logical. And have a great weekend.
You too. Thanks.
And thank you for listening. On behalf of all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. Until next weekend, find us online at virginiainstitute.org, our YouTube channel with archived footage of previous shows. Until then, I'm Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.